Ready? Okay. On behalf of the Wayator Mitzion Kollel, it is an honor to welcome so many friends, new and old. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this evening's program. This is just part of the Kollel's ongoing offerings that we are presenting to our Chicagoland Jewish community and beyond to continue to engage our community with learning, with thoughtful programming, with ways to connect with each other, with ways to continue to learn, to be inspired, to grow closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we are incredibly grateful this evening to begin a three-part series with a phenomenal educator, dear friend, and all-around amazing human being. Father, son, son-in-law, friend, he's just a tremendous resource. So not only is Dr. David Shyovitz an author of books and articles, which many of you can find in various places. You can get some of these academic works. Some of you are familiar with Dr. Shyovitz from prior talks that he's given either in the Kollel in the last couple of years, others in the community online. He speaks in conferences around the world. But some of you are familiar with Dr. Shyovitz as a member of our Chicagoland Jewish community and someone who has devoted his time and his family and his avocation to supporting our community and supporting all of us, whether it's devoting his time and volunteering for the Kollel, working with B'nai Akiva, with Hillel Torah, and being the role model for his peers and friends and those who look to him to see what it is that it means to be, what does it mean to be an upstanding model of what it means to teach by example, of being a living leader from a lay standpoint in our community. So his students benefit just down the road in Northwestern from his scholarship, but we as members of the community benefit from his just remarkable generosity in so many ways. So without any further ado, I want to thank Dr. David Shyovitz. I want to pass the baton. I'm going to spotlight his video now, and I think I need to make him unmuted. So let me see how I do that. Hang on. And then he's going to take it from here. Dr. Shyovitz, I'm going to make you a co-host, which will enable you to share slides. Actually, I'll just make you, here we go. You are now co-host of this meeting, so you should be able to share your screen, and you are now unmuted.
Okay.
Thank you very, very much. Welcome, everyone. Bechavod.
Thank you, Rabbi Brand, so much for that really generous and lovely introduction. Thanks so much to everybody for taking the time to join us. It's great to see familiar faces and familiar names here in my little panel of co-participants here, and I'm really looking forward to studying together. Let me just say a word about logistics maybe before we launch into content. Actually, this will allow me to multitask because I'm also going to share my screen to show some slides. Okay, hopefully you can all see these slides in front of you. I seem to have lost sight of the participants though. Okay, well, hopefully somebody's going to stop me if you can't see me, because I can't see you, but I can see the slides, and I'm going to pause every, I'm sorry?
We see you and we see the slides.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. It's still strange, even after teaching at Northwestern now for 3 months virtually over Zoom, there still is something very weird about standing here in an empty room and talking to a screen. But we'll make do. We have roughly an hour or so to cover 3 really incredibly important and rich and deep Jewish historical centers, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. Needless to say, in an hour, we will not do a good job of it. We'll do the best we can. And I'm hoping to just highlight a few themes, a few objects, a few personalities that will be able to give us a little bit of a taste of some of the historical significance of these sites. Within that hour, I'm hoping not to only speak, monologue style, but also to have time to take questions, to take comments. Because there's 100 or so people on the call, and because you're all muted, we're going to have to do this in an unnatural, non-interactive way. So what I'm hoping to do is just to stop every 15 minutes or so, hopefully at an appropriate point to pause, and take any questions. I'd appreciate it if you would enter questions into the chat box. Hopefully many of you know how to do that. That way I'll be able to just go to the chat, read quickly through some of the questions, take a few of them without having to sort of go back and forth with muting, unmuting. I think it'll be a little bit easier this way, even though it's not the most interactive way to do things. So I hope that's going to be all right. And obviously, at the end of our time together, we'll have as much time as people want to ask more questions and get into the weeds. Now, if I were to ask you, we're starting a 3-week session. We'll be in France next week. We'll be in Italy the week after that. If I were to ask you about your dream tourist destination, the place you'd most love to go on a romantic, exciting European getaway, I would venture to guess that for not everybody, but for many people on the call, the Rhineland towns of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz would not rise to the top of the list, right? I actually have a scientific way that I can prove this, which is that I do a fair amount of traveling in Europe to speak at conferences, to lead tours. When I go to Paris or to northern Italy or to Spain or to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, the reaction that I always get is, wow, great work if you can get it. Or are you taking Adina, my wife, are you taking your wife along with you, for this romantic getaway? When I tell people I'm heading to Germany, and specifically to these towns within Germany, so I never get that kind of a reaction. The reaction usually is, wow, better you than me. No one has ever, expressed surprise that Adina's not joining me for a romantic trip to the Rhineland. And I think the reasons for that are obvious, probably so obvious that we don't even need to articulate them. Germany in the 20th and 21st centuries has a very different status when it comes to Jewish tourism, when it comes to really, purchasing products, all of the kinds of after effects of the Second World War, of the Shoah, that I'm sure we all recognize and can relate to. And in some cases, we may embrace them ourselves. That notwithstanding, so I'd like to make the case to you tonight that these towns in Germany, and by extension, German Jewish history more broadly, is not only essential for an understanding of the Jewish historical experience, it's not only essential for understanding where we, right, as Jews, or where we as 21st century people have come from, the heritage that we draw on, whether directly or indirectly, right? But that there's also a different side of German Jewish history that often gets obscured, but that needs to be recovered. Now, the idea that Germany is sort of an off-limits place for committed Jews, the idea that Germany is not a place where you go on a vacation as a tourist destination, this actually predates to some degree 1939, 1933, right? The events leading up to and culminating in the Holocaust. Already in the 19th century and the earliest 20th century, the idea that European, especially German Jewish history, is marked as a kind of uniquely catastrophic historical experience for Jews. This is something that you find widespread in much of the scholarship that's being written at that time. So there's one sort of pithy phrase that sometimes is used, two pithy phrases. The first is that the history of Jews in Germany, the history of Jews, especially in pre-modern Europe, is a history of suffering and of scholarship, right? Of rabbis and then of persecution. Right? If you want to understand what Jews experienced during this long duration of European Jewish history, especially German Jewish history, you can sum it up with kind of obscure Talmudic learning and pogroms, persecutions, expulsions, all kinds of horrific accusations, some of which we'll talk about today, some of which we'll talk about next week. And that idea really sort of gained credence or took on a foothold within much of the most important scholarship that was written in the 19th and early 20th century. A response to that came in the 20s of the 20th century, in the 1920s and onward, in the writings of a historian, an important historian, somebody who's not terribly well known outside of the university setting, but somebody who's a very important scholar, someone named Salo Baron. Baron was a professor of Jewish history at Columbia. He was actually the first American Jewish historian to teach at an American university. And Baron coined a phrase for this way of understanding pre-modern Jewish history. He called it the lachrymose conception of Jewish history. And lachrymose is not that pithy, actually, but it's a phrase that refers to tearfulness, the tearful conception of Jewish history. There's something about, again, for our purposes, especially Germany, but by extension, pre-modern Jewish experience within Europe is marked by its tearfulness. And of course, the events of the Holocaust seem to put an exclamation mark, or several exclamation marks, on that sentence, on that idea, right? The idea that the Holocaust marks a culmination of a trend that was already 1,000 years or more in the making. In the last few decades, though, and this is going to serve as a transition for us, it's become increasingly clear that this suffering paradigm, right, that Jewish history is all about persecution, and perhaps, right, some rabbis who are writing, works of halacha, works of Talmudic commentary, other kinds of religious writings, that this only scratches the surface of the Jewish historical experience. And so today I want to take us into the heartland of pre-modern Ashkenazi Jewry, right? Ashkenazi meaning Northwestern European Jewry. So this is usually used to refer to Jews in Germany, in northern France, sometimes in England, that sort of region within Northwestern Europe. And to take you into the heartland of that territory and to show that despite what we might expect, and despite sometimes appearances, there's much more than meets the eye in the experience of Jews in this time period and in this region, and that we can actually see the monuments to that. We can see the physical remains of that much more complex and nuanced Jewish historical experience within the landscape. Now, we're going to see it on a computer screen rather than within the landscape itself, but I hope that some of the excitement that we would feel if we were watching this in person, right? If we were actually looking or touching or observing these physical monuments, I hope some of that will translate to this virtual setting as well. Now, let's get ourselves geographically situated for starters. The three towns that we're going to be talking about today are all relatively close to one another. I hope you can see the arrow here where I'm going to sort of point out some of the landmarks. And those are the towns here in the northernmost star of Mainz, a little bit further south of Worms, and a little further south of that, Speyer. Speyer is not marked here, but that star corresponds to Speyer. Now, where are we geographically? I'm sure some of you can see we're not far from what is today the border between Germany in the east and France, Belgium, Luxembourg on the west. We are topographically within a valley, the Rhine Valley, and that's because this sort of a plateau here, right, this valley region, traces the Rhine River, which actually connects these towns to one another, but also connects them to other centers of Jewish life much further north, towns like Bonn and Cologne, and there are other towns along the Rhine River as well that had prominent Jewish communities. But for various reasons that we'll get into, Mainz, Worms, and Speyer really take pride of place in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries and onward. Now, before we focus in on these three towns, though, it is worth noting that by the time Jews become settled, become entrenched, become sort of culturally embedded within these three cities, there has been a Jewish presence in Germany already. In fact, the earliest Jewish presence in what is today Germany is in the town of Cologne, of Köln. And you can see here that that Jewish history is actually becoming increasingly apparent in the physical landscape. So over the last decade or more, there's been a real intensive effort to recover, to literally dig out of hiding, out of the ground, the very deep and sort of historically significant Jewish presence in the city of Cologne. So these are the excavations right in the center of town. You can see the Cologne Cathedral in the background here. This is the historical center of this German city. And we can see all sorts of Jewish communal buildings. We can see here under this tent, we can't really see through the canvas, but if we could, we'd see underneath the well-preserved remains of a Jewish synagogue, of a shul. There's a mikveh that's adjacent to it. And this is excavation work that's been going on for years, will continue to go on for years likely, is going to be culminating in a Jewish museum in Cologne. I've heard a number of presentations by people who are affiliated with this, and the amount of sort of cultural material that they are locating, that they're digging out of the ground, is really staggering. Just to give you one cutesy example, so they found some of the first recorded Hebrew inscriptions from Germany within this former Jewish neighborhood, within the Jewish quarter in Cologne. I don't know if anybody can read the Hebrew, can make out what it says here. You might expect that the first Hebrew inscription to be discovered is going to be something very holy, something associated with scholarship, something, right, associated with the synagogue maybe. This is actually a Hebrew sign that reads Zeh chalon leotzit so'a derech sham. This is a sign for a Jewish bathroom. The cesspit would be emptied right underneath this marker, and this is a sign in Hebrew to presumably the Jewish workers who are doing sewer duty, right? So again, not scholarship, and I guess it's suffering of a certain sort, right? Not the persecution kind of suffering, but to show you that the Jewish daily lived experience is happening in some cases in Hebrew or using Hebrew language, that Jews are living within this culture with day-to-day lives in ways that we can still recover and see evidence of today. So the Jewish presence in Cologne, which is the earliest one that we can date in Germany, goes back to 321. In 321, Cologne and Germany is still part of the Roman Empire. There's a document from the Emperor Constantine that makes reference to Jews living in Cologne. But we have to go forward quite a bit in time to find more traces of Jews in Germany, and at least historically significant ones. And that, again, is to those towns that we saw marked on the map, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, which come to be referred to in the medieval Hebrew sources as Kehilot Shum, right? Shum, Shin for Speyer, the Vav for Worms, and the Mem for Mainz. This sign that you're seeing here, Shum, Schumstedt, is the local German municipal center that, like the museum folks in Cologne, is devoted to recovering this German Jewish history for Germany, right? So this is an initiative that we'll see more of as we go along by Germans in the Rhineland trying to recover their own Jewish history and trying to, in fact, achieve UNESCO status for these three towns. We'll know by next year in 2021 when the next list of UNESCO sites comes out whether they were successful. But this is really a sort of important priority for various German municipalities to put their German Jewish history back on the map, again, literally to dig it out from underground where it had been hiding for so many years. Where did Jews who make their way to Kehilot Shum come from? So we know that there were Jews in Germany in 321. We know that by the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, there are increasingly large and thriving Jewish communities in this Rhine Valley region. In between, it's hard to say very much. We don't know whether there were continuous German Jewish communities. There's some evidence that would suggest that there were. There's some evidence that suggests maybe not. We do know, however, that the main rabbinic leaders who occupy sort of positions of rabbinic authority in the Kehilot Shum are not coming from Cologne. They're not coming from Germany at all. They're coming from, of all places, southern Italy, which at the time is controlled or is fought over by Muslim forces and by the Byzantine Empire. So sort of significant is the Jewish presence within southern Italy, which is not a place maybe some of us might think of as being a heartland of Jewish history. So significant were these communities that none less than Rabbeinu Tam, Rabbi Jacob Tam, the most important French Tosafist, the most important of the French rabbinic scholars associated with the Baalei Tosafot, a name that might be familiar to some of you, maybe not to all of you, but a really important rabbinic figure. So he coins the phrase to refer to the leaders, the rabbinic leaders of this southern Italian region. He says, Ki mibari tetzei Torah udvar Hashem meotranto. I'm sure many of you recognize the reference there. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah udvar Hashem miyerushalayim is what we're accustomed to thinking. Torah comes from Zion, it comes from Jerusalem. Not for the Jews in Ashkenaz. They're more accustomed to thinking of Torah as originating in a certain sense, or at least deriving from this the heel of the Italian boot, where Bari and Otranto and other important Jewish communities are located. Now, there's some very ambiguous historical data about exactly when and exactly for what purposes Jews ended up migrating northward from southern Italy to set up shop in the Rhineland and in Germany and in France as well, and other parts of greater Ashkenazic communities. The primary motives seem to have been economic. There's one source, again, somewhat ambiguous source, that says that the Emperor Charles invited Jews to settle in the heartland of his kingdom in order to provide an economic stimulus. Now, that Emperor Charles is hard to pinpoint. There's a good likelihood that it might be Charlemagne, Charles the Great, the emperor of the Frankish Empire around the year 800. And there's some reason to think the dating of that would work out nicely. It might have been one of his successors. There actually are a lot of King Charles or Emperor Charles running around over the course of the 9th and 10th centuries. Regardless of exactly who and exactly when, we do know that when Jews set up shop in these towns, they are being invited in by the rulers for overtly economic purposes. There's a reputation already in the 9th and 10th centuries, a well-deserved reputation, that Jews have a certain commercial acumen, that Jews are tied into various kinds of economic networks, trade networks, that Jewish communities which are scattered throughout the diaspora are connected to one another and are able to be very, very effective in long-term, long-distance trading. Excuse me. And so Charlemagne or some other King Charles or whoever it might have been sort of rightly realizes that if he wants to provide an economic shot in the arm to his territories, inviting in some Jews who are connected to these broader economic networks might be a good move. We can get a sense of just how important Jews are seen within these towns from a fascinating document, and we're going to sort of look at a couple of documents, but obviously our main time is going to be looking at monuments and buildings and other kinds of settings on the ground. In this document from 1084, the ruler of Speyer, a bishop named Rudiger Hausmann, this is the guy who's calling the shots and deciding who gets to live in Speyer, who's allowed in and who's not. So he says, in the name of the Holy and Undivided Trinity, when I wanted to make a city out of the village of Speyer, I, Rudiger, thought that the glory of our town would be augmented 1,000-fold if I were to bring Jews. Now, if you're used to thinking about Germany and German Jewish history solely through the lens of the Holocaust, this probably comes like a bolt of lightning. When I wanted my village to become a city, when I wanted to move into the major leagues, so I, the bishop, right, the Christian ruler of Speyer, decided there's nothing I can do for our town that would be better than if I were to get some Jews. 1,000-fold glory will accrue to our town if only I can find some Jews to settle here. And Jews are, in this period, in high demand. It's not easy to get Jews to settle in your town because this document is one of many documents trying to attract Jews to live within these German settlements. So he offers them favorable terms. He says, I'm going to give the Jews their own region of town to live in. I'll protect them with a wall. I'm going to encircle them with a wall and allow them to have their own region to live in. Now, in 2 weeks, those of you who are here will hear about the ghetto of Venice and ghettoization of Jews. This is not that. There's a lot of evidence that shows that the Jews were dying for a wall to live behind. They understood that, at least initially, they were going to need to live on their own terms and in their own communities. And Rudiger gives them this very favorable treatment. He carves out a part of the city center and gives it over to the Jews as basically their own city within a city. He gives them land from the church to be a cemetery. He gives them all kinds of economic incentives. We're not going to read through all of this together now. Suffice it to say, this is a kind of favorable legal treatment that any Christian in Speyer would kill for, right? The Jews are, in fact, being given much better terms than they have any right to expect and that non-Jews would ever have access to. That document in Speyer, so again, shows us a kind of a model or a paradigm for how Jews come to settle in these towns. We know, however, that the Jewish traders and merchants who arrive are in large part not only traders, but also people who have deep connections to rabbinic dynasties. So the figures who are most closely associated with these early stages of migration to Mainz and to Worms and to Speyer come from extended rabbinic families in southern Italy and elsewhere. They're invited in for their economic benefit, but they also form quickly Jewish communities that are unmatched in their learning, in their scholarship. And we can get a sense of a few of these individuals from the cemetery, the remains of a cemetery in the town of Mainz. We're going to start here in Mainz, the Mem in Kehilot Shum. We're not going to spend much time here because of the 3 towns that we're going to be looking at, Mainz is by far the worst preserved. There's very, very little physical evidence left of the Jewish community, unfortunately. But we can still see a few sort of tantalizing details. So one of them is in this shot of these 3 tombstones, which, if you want a zoomed out view, comes from this field near the city center of Mainz, which was once the site of a Jewish cemetery. Today, every tombstone that you see there was put there recently, right? These are tombstones that were carted away, were used either in building materials, were dug into using for foundations of buildings, had all kinds of other secondary purposes after the Jews leave Mainz, which happens in the end of the Middle Ages, for reasons that maybe we'll get to. There's a long period of time where Jewish community in Mainz is not strong, from the 1600s or so onward. And these tombstones are slowly recovered in recent years, in recent decades. And as the sort of municipal government of Mainz discovers these relics of Jewish life, they've tried to some degree to reassemble some semblance of a Jewish cemetery. Again, you can see it's pretty sparse and not terribly impressive, at least compared to some of the other cemeteries we'll see in a little while. However, the names are quite significant. The left-hand tombstone here says Ponikvar, Rabna Meshulam ben Rabna Rebbe Kolonimus. Meshulam ben Kolonimus, a name that, for those of you who are well-versed in early Ashkenazic rabbinic scholarship, is an important name. Those of you who read piyutim, the liturgical poems that many Jewish communities today recite on the high holidays or other times in the year, this is a very important figure, somebody who left a tremendous mark on the liturgy and the worship and the scholarship of the Jews of Ashkenaz. Next to him is a tombstone that's actually a recreation. This is not the original tombstone. It was recreated at some later date, but it has the name on it, at least it memorializes one of the most important Mainz Jewish rabbis, Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or HaGolah, born in 960, spends much of his life in Mainz building up rabbinic scholarship. His moniker Me'or HaGolah means that he is the light of the exile, such an important rabbinic scholar that there's no one more important than him in the entire Jewish diaspora. He's associated with various takanot, rulings that change or develop or sort of adapt elements within Jewish law, within halakha, to the lived reality of Jews within Germany, doing away with polygamy, for example, a large array of very important legal rulings that trace back to Rabbeinu Gershom. And on the right, a tombstone, again, marking the presence or memorializing Rabbi Yehuda ben Yakar, who's best known today probably for being one of the teachers of Rashi, Rabbi Solomon ben Isaac, or Shlomo Yitzchaki, who studied in Mainz in the 11th century. We'll talk more about Rashi maybe next week when we get to Paris, when we talk about French Jewish history. But actually, we'll talk about a little bit more about Rashi when we get to Worms as well. So these three sort of tantalizing remains of the rabbinic scholarship of Mainz are, I'd say, the tip of the iceberg of what would have been in a cemetery like this one when the community was in its most thriving period. Today, maybe it's marked more by absence than by presence. And the German municipality of Mainz has tried, again, to compensate for hundreds of years worth of neglect of this Jewish material culture with this monstrosity. Sorry, I shouldn't say monstrosity. There's no accounting for taste. Some people might like this. Aesthetically, this does nothing for me. But if you like this, then that's just fine. You can write in the chat what it is that you like about it. It's a synagogue that was built within the last decade in Mainz. And it was designed in order to write out in concrete. Let's see if this is one view. Here's another view. To write out in concrete the word Kiddusha. You see this massive, massive synagogue in its entirety, a panoramic shot. You would see that it's an attempt, a kind of an abstract attempt to write a building that says holiness, Kiddusha. You can see probably here the kuf, and then there's a dalid over here. It's quite abstract, but I guess comes from a good intention on the part of the Christian, incidentally, architects who worked on this to reinscribe the faded Jewish community within the urban landscape. Now, in the midst of this concrete sort of massive building, there's a stone engraving that's meant to mimic the tombstone that we saw a moment ago. You can see it says in the center here, Me'or HaGolah, the light of the exile, Beit Knesset Magensa, the synagogue of Mainz. Magensa is the medieval Hebrew term for the city of Mainz. Now, in referring to this synagogue as Me'or HaGolah, the architect, the designer, again, is obviously drawing on Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or HaGolah, the most important early Ashkenazic rabbi. The irony, of course, is that this massive synagogue, which can fit hundreds and hundreds of people, today sits almost entirely empty almost all of the time. And not just because of COVID. I was there, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, most recently, and it's a beautiful, or at least a sort of impressive, a staggeringly large and expensive building that sits with a guard and maybe one or two tourists who stop by to take pictures. There's no regular minyan there. There's very little regular programming there. Mainz, for better or worse, is simply not a center of Jewish life in modern-day Germany. And this attempt to sort of reinstate it within the landscape, I think, is a fascinating example of what a German Jewish community in the aftermath of the Holocaust tries to accomplish, and sort of with what benefit, right? That's something that we can maybe think about or debate. The same is not true of the neighboring town of Worms, where there's actually a staggering amount of Jewish history left. And we'll see some examples of that. But before we do, let me pause and check the chat and see if anyone has asked any questions. Let's see if I can figure out how to check the chat. Okay, let's try that. Okay, somebody sent me a private message that they can't see the full image of something. I apologize for that if there's anything that didn't come through. Elliot Robinson, the synagogue does look a little bit like a 3-year-old grandson's creation. I have a 3-year-old daughter, and let's hope that she has a future in architecture, because apparently the cost of entry seems like it's pretty low. The synagogue is an Ashkenazi synagogue, as I'm sure we would expect. Within Germany. But again, to be an Ashkenazi or a Sephardi synagogue would imply that there are people praying there. And by and large, there are no people praying there. There's occasional, I think on the high holidays, there's probably services, but this is, a largely defunct synagogue, or maybe we should say it's there for reasons other than, promoting daily worship, right? There's a synagogue that is there for a good reason, but not the reason we might expect from a synagogue. Okay, please keep the questions coming as we go along, but I'm going to share my screen once again and take us into the town of Worms, where we can see the city center, right? There's the historic center of Worms. Right in the center, the dome. Dome is the German word for the cathedral. So this is the Cathedral of St. Peter. We'll see some pictures of it in a moment, the sort of monumental Gothic architectural structure that marks the center of medieval and early modern Worms. And just in terms of proximity, so already it's probably striking to notice that the synagogue, the medieval synagogue in Worms, is just a couple minutes walk from the center of town. The Jewish cemetery, which we'll see some pictures of in a moment, is literally across the street from the cathedral. When we think about the Jews, again, situatedness within these German settings, their embeddedness. So the Speyer model that we saw is one model, Jews living behind a wall in their own sort of protected cocoon. The Worms model is somewhat different. The Jews are living smack in the center of town, again, giving you an indication that their integration within society is much more sort of enmeshed than we might tend to expect. Here is that synagogue that we saw a moment ago. A view from the entranceway. We'll talk in a moment about what these different wings of the building correspond to. But just to give you a sense of sort of the overall shape of the building. So this is a sort of far more long distance shot, a zoomed out shot of this entranceway. The modern entrance into the building today is through here. Here's from the southern angle. You can see this is the back side of this. And it has this little sort of cupola, this semicircular addition built onto the side. And here is what would have been the main entranceway to the main synagogue when this building was in more regular use. Now, the building itself dates back to the 11th century, the late 11th century. And what we're seeing today, at least this part of the building, right, this and this, is a very close approximation of what Jews would have been praying in over the course of the Middle Ages. Now, it's an approximation because it's important to note that this actual building that we're looking at was built in the 1960s. And that's because the original synagogue, or I should probably say one incarnation of the original synagogue, was burned in 1938, in November 1938 during Kristallnacht. We're seeing here early stages of the fire that destroyed this building. By the end of Kristallnacht, this building was in ruins, right? It was totally in rubble, and it remained that way through much of the Second World War and into the 1950s. In terms of its origin, however, so this, this shot of the building, right, this wing, corresponds to the original synagogue building that was built in the 11th century. It was destroyed in 1096 during the First Crusade and rebuilt shortly afterwards. It was renovated in the 1200s when this wing was built on, right? Again, it's hard to do this with pictures, but back here is this. And then in front of it, this was a later addition in the 1200s, in the 13th century, when it was built as an Ezrat Nashim, or the Germans call this the Frauenschule, the women's synagogue. So this would have been the women's quarters for prayer, and the wall connecting it to this would be broken by a screen, and there'd be the ability for women to have a sort of a set place to pray within the synagogue worship. As I'm sure many or all of us know, over the course of the Middle Ages and into modernity, for many communities, men and women pray separately, or at least in separate parts of the synagogue sanctuary. And the addition of this women's synagogue in the 13th century was sort of a physical manifestation of the ability of women to have somewhat more of a role in Jewish worship. This addition was built in the 1700s, in the early in the 17th century, excuse me, in the early 1600s, when the synagogue once again was destroyed. So this was rebuilt again in the 17th century, this time with this addition. This addition is sometimes called the Rashi Chapel or the Rashi Yeshiva. Needless to say, by the 17th century, Rashi had been dead for 500 years. He never set foot in this building. However, it does give you a sense of the sort of cultural attachment to the figure of Rashi that's very, very deep in Worm's Jewish culture. So this synagogue itself is sometimes called the Rashi Shul, even though, once again, the building itself dates from well after Rashi's lifetime. But there's this sense of connection with this great Jewish scholar who did spend time in Mainz and in Worms studying. The only remains really that we have of the original synagogue, or the early incarnations of the synagogue, are some of this stonework around the entranceway, which was recovered from the ruins after Kristallnacht and rebuilt, and these plaques, which indicate who, if you've been into any synagogue in the world, I'm sure you've seen some version of this, who's paid the money, who gets the naming rights over the building campaign, right? So this marks and commemorates and memorializes some of the big donors from the community who contributed to building the original incarnations of the shul, and so it's probably fitting that their memory has been maintained this many hundreds of years later. Now, if you were to go into the inside of the synagogue, I don't think I have a shot of it, but you would not be terribly impressed. The interior is entirely redone, sort of in a modern approximation of what it would have looked like long ago, but there's very little sort of authentic interior detail. However, so fascinatingly, I think this is maybe the most interesting part of the synagogue for our purposes. So if you look along the edge here of the alleyway down this sort of path on the left-hand side of the synagogue. So if you were to look at it from a sort of straight-on angle, you would see this indentation within the wall. And this indentation was one of the most famous features of this synagogue over the course of the Middle Ages and early modernity. The indentation was sort of associated with a legendary story that the mother of some rabbi who was pregnant with that rabbi, originally this is a story that was told about a figure named Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, Rabbi Judah the Pious, a very important German Jewish scholar from the 13th century. Eventually the story would be told about Rashi himself, again, as the synagogue becomes associated with Rashi. The story goes that Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid's mother, or maybe Rashi's mother, was walking down this narrow path one day when a Christian wagon driver was trying to maneuver his wagon in the opposite direction down that same alleyway. And the alleyway is very narrow, the wagon was very wide, and Rashi, or Rabbi Yehuda Chassid's mother, was about to be crushed. And so the wall of the synagogue opened up and literally swallowed her up momentarily until the wagon passed by, and then spat her back out again. And the indentation that remains was, for the Jews of Worms, a sort of a tactile symbol of the fact that their synagogue had almost supernatural sanctity. Right? This was a feature of the synagogue that proved that God was willing to intervene directly, or that the objects of the town, the sort of built atmosphere of the town, was imbued with so much sanctity that it could literally act in history and save, right, maintain, preserve the Jewish scholars who walked the streets of this city. Now, this is a fascinating indentation that we're looking at because it tells a history that never happened in two different senses, right? On the one hand, this story, I think it's safe to say, is a legend that has little historical basis in reality, and that's because the story only developed much after the lifespan of Rashi and Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. The building itself didn't exist when Rashi was alive, right? It was built afterwards. So the historical data here is very, very sort of suspicious. On top of that, the indentation we're seeing here, again, is one that was built by German engineers in the 1960s when they tried to rebuild and reapproximate a historical monument that had been lost, right? So this is an effort on their part to recreate an imagined German Jewish history. So it sort of is two steps removed from historical reality, but shows us the way in which the historical monuments of this period can act almost as a palimpsest, right? Where there's sort of layers of historical meaning that accrue onto these objects, where we have a tradition associated with this rabbi or maybe with that rabbi, which has all kinds of sort of symbolic weight for the Jews who lived within this town, and then the attempt to recreate that meaning in these drastically changed circumstances after the Second World War. Again, it's a fascinating, I think, dynamic that shows some of the very complicated and sort of nuanced ways that we need to read these sources. We can't take them necessarily at face value, but sometimes the deeper meanings are that much more fascinating. Now, that story about the mother of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, or maybe the mother of Rashi, is preserved in a text called Sefer Ma'aseh Nisim, the book of miraculous events, which tells over all of the folklore of Worms Jewish history. It was written by a rabbi named Rabbi Yuspa Shamish in the early modern period, in Yiddish. Those of you who are reading the text here, you may recognize that this was written not in Hebrew, but in Yiddish. And this text, and many like it, again, preserve all of those miraculous events, all of that collective memory that made living within this town sort of an intergenerational experience, where people could walk by a synagogue and be tactilely, physically connected to these stories about rabbis who had lived hundreds of years earlier. Adjacent to the synagogue, if we were to turn our gaze, right, perpendicular to the synagogue, we'd see this plaque, another surviving medieval 12th century plaque, which lists the donors not to the synagogue, but to the town's mikvah, the ritual bath. And as we proceed into the grounds, downstairs, forgive me that we've got a guy here in the middle. That's not me, by the way, but he, right, it's like photobombing. So as we proceed down the steps, out of the daylight, sort of as if you're looking at the screen, you're in the mikvah, right? And the beyond the screen is the exterior, as you can see. And as you walk in down the steps, you're taken in this circular staircase deep down under the ground. The mikvah in Worms is something like 15 meters deep, which is 45, 46 feet deep, almost 5 stories under the ground, right? Where it takes you eventually into what would have looked at the time like the Gothic cathedral that's just across the street. The sort of archways, the pillars, the columns, the decorative motifs here, to the extent that we can reconstruct them, would have had a almost 50-foot tall Gothic building buried underneath the ground, right next to the synagogue within the town of Worms. And again, the symbolism here is so sort of on the nose that it almost is impossible to miss. The Jews are building structures that look just like those of their Christian neighbors. This is the Gothic architecture that makes the medieval Worms Cathedral we'll see pictures again in a moment, so spectacular. The Jews are adopting those same technologies, but they're embedding them underneath the ground of their synagogue, right? It's literally buried beneath their own holy places, right? In a way that is invisible to the outside world, but that once you sort of step underneath the ground, is unmissable. So stylistically and aesthetically, this is a really interesting, I think, articulation of how Jews in medieval Worms are tied into their surrounding culture. In Speyer, we see another of these beautiful monumental mikvaot. So we're moving now slightly south to Speyer while we're on the topic of mikvaot. Here's another one. Here you can see a model of what the mikvah looked like underneath the ground, right? The entranceway here corresponds to this entranceway. And as you work your way down the steps and down another circular staircases behind here, you would eventually make it down to groundwater. Again, 40 or so feet beneath the ground, where the water is not coming through the kinds of channels, right, that mikvaot today, the ritual bath today, depend upon to get mayim chayim. This is actual groundwater. They're digging down beneath the ground until they hit groundwater. The reason you can see that groundwater, incidentally, even though we're 40 feet under the ground, is because up at the top here, beyond your screen, are a series of skylights that are meant to make the interior beautiful and visible, right? This is to allow people to see where they're going. Another of these monumental mikvaot, again, we're riffing a little bit here and moving slightly out of the Rhine Valley, but in a neighboring city, Friedberg, you see the most spectacular of these medieval mikvaot, again, from the 12th and 13th centuries. This one is 25 meters under the ground, almost 8 stories, right, 75 or more feet beneath the ground, dug out painstakingly by hand, right, by artisans who then build in the staircases, who dig out of the rock, out of the bedrock, changing rooms, which you can see there's a room here, and adjacent to the mikvah, the actual ritual bath here would have been more changing rooms. Here's another image. Again, you can imagine how much work and effort it takes to build something like this. And it raises actually the question of why anyone would go to the bother of building mikvaot of this nature. Why a 25-meter deep mikvah when you have the river right down the block, right? People, when they bathe in the Middle Ages, oftentimes are bathing in the river. We know halachically that toveling yourself, right, immersing yourself in a ritual bath for legal purposes can be done in a body of water like a river. The Jews of these German towns in Friedberg, in Speyer, in Worms, also in Cologne, also in a number of other cities, go to tremendous effort to build these monumental architectural feats of engineering, which all have this very deep height. They all have, you can see here in Friedberg again, skylights lighting them up. They all have, you can see again along the sides here, what would have been changing rooms and sort of a whole communal structure of rooms and different auxiliary spaces buried beneath the ground. And if you think about why that may have been the case, so there's a number of reasons, I think. First and foremost, this is a statement again of Jewish embeddedness, literally physical embeddedness within Germany. We don't want to see pre-modern German Jewish history only as leading up to the Holocaust, because we're seeing that at its earliest days, right, smack in the middle of what we might think of as the lachrymose period of Jewish history, Jews are digging out of the rock, out of the ground of Germany, a sort of a stronghold for themselves, not in the sense of a shelter, but in the sense of a statement of their own deep embeddedness. Now, at the same time, it's worth noting that many of the architectural features of these mikvaot only make sense if we think about ritual baths that were being used not only by women for purification purposes, which is what mikvaot often are used for legally, right? Women who need to purify themselves as part of their menstrual cycle, according to Jewish law. Mikvaot in these contexts are also being used by men, by families, by community members to do things like dunking their dishes. This is different vessels that are being dunked within this massive mikvah space. There's an illuminated manuscript from Germany showing some sort of a snapshot of what this kind of ritual bath would be used for. Right? It doesn't make sense to have a super deep mikvah with skylights if it's only being used by women who generally, according to Jewish law, are immersing themselves at night, right? You don't need skylights in the nighttime. It's not going to help you anyway. And so the daytime usage of these kinds of mikvaot, as a number of scholars have argued, and here I especially want to highlight two young scholars from Israel, Netta Bodner and Ariel Lehman, who wrote a really terrific recent article about this. And here I want to give credit to where I'm getting these ideas from. So as they've argued, I think shown very, very convincingly, the mikvah was like the synagogue, like the cemetery, a communal space, not just a sort of a private, out-of-the-way place for one woman at a time to go as part of their Jewish observance to immerse themselves for ritual purposes, but also for men, for families, right, as a part of sort of the shared infrastructure of the Jewish community. And so if they're going to be used in all of these manifold ways, they build them in these monumental styles, these really striking and impressive architectural engineering feats of building. Now, having talked about different stages of the Jewish life cycle, the synagogue and the mikvah, we are drawn to the end of the life cycle, which is to the cemetery. And this cemetery in Worms is the most, I think, is arguably the oldest and certainly the most impressive German Jewish cemetery that survives today. Here I'm going to try, I'm not sure it's going to be feasible. And we're running out of time. Okay, I had some videos I was going to show you of sort of walking, what it would feel like to walk the paths of the cemetery. I'm happy to show those at some future time if we have the time for it, but we're running now low on time, so I think I'm going to skip it. I will, however, take us through a few of the regions within the cemetery that are most historically significant and most historically interesting. And you can tell often which are the most historically significant graves in Jewish cemeteries by the ones that have the most rocks and slips of paper on them. This is a Jewish custom, I'm sure many of you know, that you mark your respect for the person who's died by leaving either a stone or a kvittel, a little piece of paper, on their headstone. And right near the entranceway to this cemetery, we see two such headstones, which commemorate, which are actually the burial spots of the most important German Jewish rabbi of the 13th century, and an almost totally unknown nobody who's buried right next to him. And the story of how that came to be is quite a fascinating one. So on the left, we have the tombstone that marks the burial of the Maharam Mirottenberg, Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, who was a native of Worms and whose body was brought back to Worms after his death. He served in Rothenburg as a rabbi for many years, until in 1284, he tried to flee Germany due to a whole series of sort of suffering and massacres that were going on at the time. We haven't talked a lot about the violence that faced Jews at certain points during pre-modern German Jewish history. We'll talk more about this next time a little bit when we get to France. But suffice it to say that these examples we've seen of integration and embeddedness are one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is the one that maybe we're more familiar with from the get-go, which is the suffering model, the persecution model. And the late 1200s were a period where there was much such persecution. Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg tries to flee, presumably to the land of Israel, in the midst of this ongoing sort of tumult. He's caught, or he's spotted, and arrested, and eventually sent to the king, the emperor of Germany, Rudolf I, who imprisons him and seeks to extract a ransom from the Jewish communities of Germany in exchange for freeing him. And again, the Maharam Mirottenberg, it's impossible to overstate how important he was to the rabbinic culture of the time, how learned he was, how influential he was in halacha, in sort of communal affairs. And so once he's taken captive and imprisoned for years, the communities of Germany presumably are eager to ransom him. Now the story goes, and this is a story whose historical data is not 100% clear, but it's a story that's told at least, that the Maharam Mirottenberg declined to be ransomed, that he was afraid of the precedent it would set if people could just be kidnapped and held for ransom for exorbitant amounts, right? Didn't want the idea to get out there. This was a good way of making some quick cash. And so again, the story goes, the Maharam Mirottenberg died imprisoned here in Eisenheim, in the fortress where he was being held, rather than allowing the Jewish community to redeem him and to pay a very high ransom. Now, the historical sources themselves are very mixed on this issue, and it's not necessarily the case that this was true, and this is something that historians are still are still debating. What we do know, however, with a fair amount of certainty, is that after he dies in this fortress, his body is still held by the emperor. And it's not until 1305, right? Maharam Rothenburg is kidnapped in 1284. He dies in 1291. And it's not until 14 years after his death that his body is finally ransomed by the figure you see buried next to him, someone by the name of Alexander, oh, there he is, Alexander Siskind, the son of Shlomo Zalman Wimfen. Now, this is somebody we know next to nothing about, not a well-known figure, until he comes on the scene as the wealthy Jew who's willing to ransom the body of Maharam Rothenburg. And in exchange, when they bring his body back to Worms, the sort of benefactor who has ransomed him is buried right next to him. This is a sign of a belief that's very common in the Middle Ages among Jews and Christians, something called burial ad sanctos, burial next to sanctity. The idea with being that if you're an everyday layperson, you can better your lot in the next world if you're buried next to somebody who's very holy and very whose sanctity is very, sort of very, very apparent. And so Alexander wants to be buried next to the body that he has ransomed, and he does so for reasons that are very hard to make sense of. So the tombstone itself is buried atop his gravesite, says that it was erected and carved near the benefactor of Alexander, son of Rabbi Shlomo, who passed away on the Day of Atonement, on a Thursday, etc., and who dared presume in his heart, and God delivered into his hand, a great deed to redeem our teacher, Rabbi Meir, son of Rabbi Baruch, the Maharam Rothenburg, and he therefore received the opportunity to be buried on his right side. May it be thy will that he will also have him seated next to him in the Garden of Eden among the eternally righteous. Okay, so again, an articulation of the idea that you can better your lot in the next world if you are physically close to somebody who's holy in this world, even once you're dead. A fascinating argument, though, and with this I think we're going to have to start to close, has been made recently by a historian at Ben Gurion University, a wonderful historian named Ephraim Schoensteiner, who argued that we can maybe reconstruct some of the possible rationale for why Alexander Wimfen took all this money, all these years later, to try to redeem the body of Maharam Rothenburg, based on these clues within his epitaph. We're told that he dared presume in his heart, Hashem la'o libo, and God delivered into his hand, Hashem eina liado, this great deed. Now, those don't seem like they're terribly significant phrases, but the Hebrew here is very important and might be encoding a message that doesn't sort of meet us at first glance. And in order to make sense of it, the Schoensteiner shows that the only other Alexander we can locate who's associated with the Maharam Rothenburg is actually, of all people, a murderer. Somebody who Maharam Rothenburg, in one of his responsa, one of his halachic rulings, discusses. The case here is not really significant for our purposes. Suffice it to say that this guy, Alexander, got into some trouble and was peripherally involved in the accidental murder of a fellow Jew. And the question that comes to Maharam Rothenburg is, what do we do with this guy, Alexander? Do we punish him? Does he have to repent? What kind of atonement does he need to do? And the atonement that Maharam Rothenburg lays out for him is very, very intense indeed. He needs to be bound in iron shackles. He needs to wander to and fro. He can't be integrated into any Jewish community. He sort of is made persona non grata within the entire Jewish community of Ashkenaz. And this was a not uncommon way of relating to particularly heinous sinners in this period. And those phrases, Asher mla'o libo, Hashem eina liado, actually refer to particularly wicked characters within the Bible. The only time that this phrase, Asher mla'o libo, appears in the Hebrew Bible is in reference to another famous murderer, Haman. The second phrase, Hashem ina liado, God, right, delivers into his hand, right, Hashem ina liado, to redeem Rabbi Meir. That phrase only appears once in the Bible as well, and it's in reference to an accidental murderer, somebody who is, according to the Bible, required to flee to a city of refuge. For those of you who know the details here, if you kill somebody accidentally, according to the biblical and rabbinic law, you need to flee to a city of refuge and spend some time there atoning. Now, the coincidence here is quite striking, that we know one other Alexander who's associated with the Maharam, and that's the accidental murderer, and the Alexander Wimpfen who redeems the body of Maharam and wants to be buried next to him in order to stay by his side in the Garden of Eden for the rest of his life, is another Alexander, and one whose epitaph hints at this accidental murderer regulation. So is this a coincidence? Possibly. But the, I would say, overlap in the language is striking enough that it seems quite plausible, or at least possible, that we can make sense of these tombstones not as a rabbi and his pious disciple, but actually as the most important rabbi of Ashkenaz and the murderer that he sentenced to years of wandering and suffering, who in the end of days, years later, manages to achieve atonement when he dies on the day of atonement on Yom Kippur and manages to be buried next to the very same rabbi who had set the process in motion. So really a tantalizing possibility. There's much, much more to be said about the cemetery. Yeah, well, here. There's much more to be said about the cemetery in Worms. Our time is more than up, and so I think we're going to move over to the Q&A, the final Q&A part of the presentation for those who want to stick around. But keep this view in mind, because the site here is of the cemetery in Worms with the Worms Cathedral in the background. And that cathedral, so you can see a postcard version of it here, quite striking, quite visually and aesthetically beautiful. And that view of the Jewish cemetery crumbling, decrepit, not well maintained, and then this gorgeous cathedral in the background towering over it, is quite a striking visual. It's one that gave Martin Buber, the very famous German Jewish theologian, right, one of the sort of a founder of liberal Judaism, important Jewish philosopher. So he spent some time living in Germany, and he commented in one of his public speeches, actually in January 1933, just 2 weeks before Hitler came to power as Chancellor of Germany, he commented on this juxtaposition. He said, "I live a short distance from the city of Worms, and from time to time I visit there. When I do so, I always go first to the cathedral. It's a visible harmony of members, a whole in which no part deviates from the norm of perfection. I walk around the cathedral gazing at it in perfect joy. Then I go to the Jewish cemetery. It consists of cracked and crooked stones without shape or direction. I enter the cemetery and look up from this disorder to the marvelous harmony of the cathedral, and it seems to me as if I were looking from Israel up to the church." He says, when you juxtapose our decrepit cemetery with this gorgeous cathedral, it almost smacks you in the face that the church has triumphed, that the New Testament has taken over from the Old Testament, that the Christians have superseded the Jews. Here below, there's no suggestion of form, only stones and ashes beneath the stones. The ashes are there, no matter how they've been scattered. The corporeality of human beings who become ashes is there. It's there as corporeality deep in my own memories, back into the depths of history, back as far as Sinai. He says, I've stood there, I've been united with the ashes, and through them with the patriarchs. This is a remembrance of the divine human encounter, which is granted to all Jews. The perfection of the Christian God space cannot divert me from this. Nothing can divert me from the God time of Israel. What Buber is saying here, I think, is something quite profound, right? And what we think of Buber as a Jewish theologian in general is almost besides the point. What he's saying is that the ashes, the physical remains, the death and memorialization that we see in that Worms cemetery is actually more of a statement of unity with God for the Jewish people than the perfect Christian God space is as manifest in the cathedral. Jews are tied into this intergenerational God time, where the physical corporeality that connects Jews to their ancestors, to the patriarchs, to the people who are lying beneath those headstones in the cemetery, this is a kind of a chain of Jewish connection, of Jewish tradition, that's perfectly embedded in the crumbling stones and bodies of the cemetery, and it actually speaks more to Jewish devotion in Germany than the cathedral with all of its perfect abstract splendor does for the neighboring Christian community. Now, Buber, of course, didn't know that 2 weeks later Hitler was going to come to power as chancellor. Buber flees to, and ends up living in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University, teaching at the Hebrew University, and and many of his fellow German Jews are, of course, not nearly so lucky. But as we think about the long hundreds of years of history that take us up until that point, so we wouldn't, I think, want to be anachronistically seeing all of that prior history only through the backward lens of the Holocaust. If anything, it makes sense even today to want to tie into, to understand, to grapple with the material culture and the traditions and the history that Jews had within Germany and within this German Jewish heartland for so many hundreds of years during the most formative periods of Jewish history. We'll tie into some of these same themes next time when we talk about Paris, and some themes that will then carry us forward as well into our third week on Venice. But I think we'll stop here. Again, for those of you who have been kept longer than you would have liked, I apologize. But I will spend a couple of minutes now taking questions from anybody who wants to stick around and do the Q&A. 8:37. Okay, we're 7 minutes over, but I do see that there are some people who are adding questions into the chat. So let's go through a few of them. Let's go through a few of them together. Let's see. Okay, so Jackie asked, what kind of synagogue? I assume this is the one in Mainz that we were talking about before, based on the timestamp. So those who were wondering about that Kedusha synagogue, the very abstract one that looked like a 3-year-old might have designed it. It is liturgically an Orthodox synagogue, I believe. I'm not 1,000% sure about this, but I'm pretty sure. Again, the existing Jewish community in Mainz is so infinitesimal, and in the surrounding region too, that it almost, for much of the year is besides the point. The closest, there's other German towns not far away that have much more vibrant Jewish communities. In Frankfurt, which we of course didn't have time to talk about. In other cities nearby. Düsseldorf has a Jewish community, and there are others too. Let's see. Somebody wrote to me. Okay, that's a private message. This is amazing. Rabbi Yehuda Hasid wrote to me privately that it was his mother. Rashi has not written in, so I guess that settles the issue. Next time, Yehuda Hasid, if you're still listening, feel free to write to the entire group, because now I've had a private revelation, and that, I'm not sure how well I'll be trusted to convey your views from beyond the grave. Who paid for the synagogue in Mainz? An excellent question. The synagogue was, I think, cost something like 10 million euros. I don't remember the exact total amount, but not a small amount of money. And much of it was paid by the municipality. It was paid by by various German governments. And here it's also worth pointing out, again, not only, I think, would we be mistaken to only see German Jewish history through the lens of the Holocaust, right? As I've tried to show you, there's a lot of other sides of the story, and we've only, again, touched on the tip of the iceberg. But in the post-Holocaust period, it's really striking and quite remarkable the extent to which people in Germany, non-Jews in Germany, have tried to rehabilitate and to rediscover the German Jewish history that lies within their cities. So again, the example that we saw in Cologne, or the examples that we saw in Kehilot Shum, of local municipalities funding these excavation efforts, these reconstruction efforts. If you want to sort of study what I study, which is pre-modern Jewish history, so I spend a lot of time in Germany, in Frankfurt and in Berlin. People are studying in Trier and in Munich. There are these major centers of German Jewish history, many of them staffed by some Jews, but many non-Jews, who study Hebrew, who study rabbinics, who read German Jewish sources, and who have actually contributed immensely to the reconstruction of our understanding of pre-Holocaust German Jewish history. So in the same way that the historical record is more complicated, our own present day is actually more complicated as well. I have a number of friends in Germany who, it's the middle of the night in Germany right now, so I don't think they're on the line, but a number of friends and colleagues in Germany who wrote to me when they saw that this was happening, saying, oh, I'd love to hear it. The truth is they probably could give many of these talks as well or much better than I could, because there's such a deep thirst, I think, in some regions for studying this history within a German context. Okay, let's see.